It's one of the most popular and powerful web application frameworks today. It's backed by Google, and yet it's notoriously hard to learn. Or is it? Maybe to learn it, you need to truly understand it. Welcome to Learn and Understand AngularJS. I'm your instructor, Tony Alisea. I'm a 15-year veteran of web application development and user experience design, and I've watched as the landscape has changed over the years as web software development has gotten easier, as web software has gotten more powerful in many ways. AngularJS represents a new paradigm for web application development, and it's truly something that every web developer, web designer, user experience designer should become familiar with. And yet it's tough to learn for a lot of people because it uses concepts and vocabulary that can be difficult to understand. So this course is going to take us through the major elements of AngularJS, but in a special way. I don't believe that you can learn by imitating other people's code. The problem is that real-world scenarios are always slightly or completely different than the scenarios that you get when you're learning something in a course or a book. So while examples are useful, you don't just want to imitate other people's code to learn. What you want is to understand. Understand what tools are doing for you. Understand how things actually work. So in this course, you're not just going to imitate me writing code. You're going to understand some fundamental JavaScript principles that are necessary to understand how AngularJS works. And we'll talk about how AngularJS works, how it does the things it does, and we'll then be able to understand the examples that we'll look at, but in a way that you'll be able to apply what you've learned to your own applications and to your own career. So that's it. Welcome to the course. It's time to get started. Like I said, one of the big problems with AngularJS is the vocabulary. The guys that built it are very, very smart people. Obviously, people that have studied computer science. So they use very scientific terminologies when discussing and naming certain aspects of AngularJS. And that can feel like it's hard to understand and hard to learn, but not really. It's just vocabulary. So as we go through the course, keep a lookout for this. Every now and again, I'll drop you one of these. Big word alert. And what does that mean? That means it's going to be some word that's unnecessarily long and complicated sounding for what usually is a pretty simplistic concept. So whenever you see that alert, in case of emergency, we'll break glass. I'll give you the word and the definition, and if necessary, a bit more detail, and then we'll look at some concrete examples. So as we go through this course, don't be hampered by vocabulary terms. Remember, it's just vocabulary. You can learn it, you can understand it, you can move forward. So AngularJS and other frameworks like it have come into being to solve some problems. Some sticky situations when it comes to modern web development. We're trying to make web software and websites feel more natural, feel more fluid. And we're trying to lower the amount of work that's necessary to build a really good web application. So what are the kind of problems that AngularJS is trying to solve in the first place? And knowing that will help you understand how it works and how it accomplishes solving those problems. All right, so let's look at some example code. I'm going to use brackets for the rest of this course as my code editor. If you've never heard of brackets or don't have it, you can go to brackets.io. It's free, it's created by Adobe, and it's focused on web development. You can download it for Mac, for Linux, or for Windows. So I'll open up brackets, and we're going to look at a quick example. What's nice about brackets is I can just open a folder. I've got one already on my desktop just to show you this example. And once I have the code in this folder opened, I can just hit this live preview button in the upper right corner, and it pops open the site that I have open in my browser running locally in a little web server. So I can just hit this button and run this site as if it was sitting on the internet. So that's what we're going to do from now on. We'll open in brackets and use live preview to look at the running site. Now that said, what's our little example? Well, also for the rest of this course, I'll be using Bootstrap. If you've been using Bootstrap before, it'll be familiar. If you haven't, it's just some CSS that's pre-made for you, essentially. You can go to getbootstrap.com and find classes that you can add to your HTML, CSS classes that will pretty things up, make things look better. So all of the stuff we'll build, I'm going to use Bootstrap to make it a little bit easier. So here I've got a quick little site. I've got some HTML, I've got Bootstrap and jQuery. Also, for everything I'll be doing in this course, I'm going to increase the font size just a little bit from standard Bootstrap, just to make things a little bit easier for you to see. Now that said, here's what I actually have in this little application. I've got a couple of buttons called Step 1 and Step 2, and a couple of panels that contain some information for each of those steps. I'll go ahead and go to the live preview. You can see what happens. A little web server starts. So I've got two buttons, Step 1, Step 2. I click Step 1, I get the Step 1 panel. Click Step 2, I get the Step 2 panel. Pretty simple conceptually. Now you've probably written something like this before. It's assumed that you have a little bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript experience if you're coming to this course. And perhaps you've written some jQuery. So you've probably written some code that looks like this, at least at some point. Let's look at the code. So I've got some jQuery code. I've got a variable which is my current step. I start off by hiding those two panels. Remember, they have their IDs, so I have to know what their IDs are. I hide them. And then those two buttons, I have to handle the click event of those buttons. And so when those buttons are clicked, again, I have to know the ID. I hide one of the panels and I show the other. And I update a variable in the JavaScript, and then probably I'd go off and update the database or something so that I know what step the user's on. And for Step 2, I have to do the same thing, just the other way around. Hide Step 1, show Step 2, set a variable, update the database maybe. Now this doesn't look that bad, but imagine if this had 20 steps, or if there was other complex logic that was involved. The problem is that you spend a lot of time updating the document object model, or the DOM. Now you probably know what that is. If you don't, it's basically the representation of the HTML that sits inside the browser's memory. That's a way for us to manipulate the HTML in code, and also to read it and see what all of the HTML on the page is, its attributes and various values. So we're manipulating the DOM here. We're hiding and showing these panels, and we're responding to events, and we're updating variables in the JavaScript. We're doing a lot of management ourselves. And after a while, this gets really hairy. It gets really difficult to deal with, and it can become just overwhelming. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could just update one side and the other side updated automatically? Update the HTML and the JavaScript updates. Update the JavaScript and the HTML updates. That's the basic idea that's behind the various frameworks that, like AngularJS, have become popular. We'll get more into that, but here's the problem we're trying to solve. This complexity of managing both the DOM, the document object model, the HTML, and all of the logic, and the variables, the data, and we have to do all of that manually. So this is one of the big problems that AngularJS is solving, along with some others. So let's get into how these problems are going to be solved, and what are some of the basic concepts that AngularJS uses to solve them. So we need a concept. We have data on one side, and we have HTML on the other. And we want to connect those two things. We want whatever happens on one to affect the other, and vice versa, automatically, without us having to do it manually. Well, that idea has actually been around in software development for a really long time. A concept called Model View Controller, or MVC. There's a slightly newer concept called Model View View Model, or MVVM. AngularJS doesn't exactly do either one of those, though. It does something called Model View whatever. That's actually what they call it. What does that mean? Well, suppose we have our model, which is our data, the thing that defines our data. In the case of JavaScript, let's say it's a variable, for example, a first name, my name. Then you have the view. That's the thing that people see, whatever the user interacts with. In the case of a web application, that's HTML. So that would be the view. And in this concept of model, view, and something else, the something else is something that ties, or the term that's used, binds the model and the view. The model and the view are bound. So whatever happens to the model automatically affects the view, and whatever happens in the view automatically affects the model, without us having to do it manually in code. Now, the thing that binds them involves controllers or something called view models, which is a model specifically for that particular view, that particular screen. AngularJS doesn't really care what you call it, because you can do it a few different ways, but the same basic structure is in place: a model and a view and something that binds them. And so we call what AngularJS is MV star, literally model, view, whatever. AngularJS has a thing that lets you bind your model, the data, the JavaScript, objects, and variables to the view, the HTML, or in reality the DOM, the document object model, the representation of the HTML in the browser's memory. So the objects and the data are connected to the thing that lets the browser paint or render onto the screen the web page. MV star. That's the concept. That's what AngularJS does. So we'll see some examples in just a little bit. So this is our first aside. It's an HTML aside. Through the course, every now and again we'll have one of these, and what this means is we won't be talking directly about AngularJS, but about a fundamental concept of HTML or JavaScript that we want to make certain we review real briefly, because it's key to whatever the AngularJS concept is that we're about to learn. Make sense? So we'll learn this, and then we'll be able to understand AngularJS better. So our first aside is custom attributes in HTML. So let's take a quick look at what we mean by custom attributes. I have my empty Bootstrap framework here, and I'm just going to add a simple piece of HTML content, a header. Hello world. Now, when I run this in the browser downloads all this HTML, puts it into memory, creates the document object model, its copy of all this in memory, and paints it to the screen. Hello world. Now I can add an attribute to this element. Let's say I add a style attribute, and I say I want an 8-pixel font size. Brackets automatically refreshes the browser window for me, and I can see that the font is smaller. That's because the guys that wrote the browser, that coded the browser, knew that this particular attribute was something that should affect how the screen is rendered, and so they re-render the screen. They change how the screen renders when that attribute is present. However, I can add a completely different attribute to the HTML. For example, let's say I called my attribute reply, and I said hello back, and then I refresh. Notice that nothing has changed on the screen. Why? Well, because this attribute, being a custom attribute, something that is not part of the HTML standard, well, the guys and girls that wrote the browser, they didn't bother looking for this. And so it doesn't affect the web page at all visually. However, it's still there in the browser's memory. It's still there inside the document object model. Let's prove that. I've got my app.js reference here, just a reference to a JS file so I can play around at the bottom of the web page so jQuery won't give me any headaches. I'm just going to take this h1 since it's the only h1 there, and I'm going to get that reply attribute, and actually I'm going to log that to the console in the browser, the developer console. I'll hit F12. Let me just refresh this again, and you can see that it outputted. Now if you're wondering, I've got the font turned up here on the console. You can hold down the control or command key and zoom in and zoom out with your mouse, or the plus or minus, or your mouse scroll wheel. So I just want to keep this a bit large so you can see it in the video. But anyway, you can see that the value of that attribute was outputted. It had no effect on visually how the page was rendered, but it's sitting there in the DOM. Now, HTML5 actually has an official version of this. It's called data dash attributes. You can put data, then dash, then whatever you want, and you'll get that value. Now that's considered valid official HTML5. Now what Angular does is it actually doesn't follow that pattern, although you can if you want to. It put ng dash, and then, well, it has several different attributes, custom attributes that it can use, or it uses, that's available to you, and we'll look at some of those. But just to understand, when you see ng dash in the HTML as we go forward, that's really a custom attribute, and AngularJS is using the fact that the browser DOM, the memory, has that available to then make decisions based on what it sees in those attributes, the values of those attributes. If you really want to be sticky about being HTML5 compliant, AngularJS does allow this as well. It'll look for data dash and g dash something or other. But for the rest of this course, we'll just use ng dash and then some of the built-in attributes that AngularJS will look for and do something with. But for now, that's the basic concept. Now it's undefined because I need to change what I'm looking for there. And there we go. So ng reply is my little custom attribute I just made up. And it's there in the DOM and I can access it. So knowing that you have these custom attributes is an important concept. I bet you thought we were done with the sides. Nope, we need one more before we move on. This one's a JavaScript aside. It's a really important concept called the global namespace. So what do we mean by the global namespace? Well, I'm going to go back to this little Hello World web page and I'm going to run it. And when it runs and the browser loads it and paints it to the screen, I now have a piece of memory on my computer that's dedicated to this web page where I can put my JavaScript objects and the variables and do things. So if I create a variable, let's say person, and I'm going to call it Tony, just a string. And then I'm going to output it to the console. So there it is, Tony. Now I've stuck this variable in the global namespace. It's up at the top of the memory, if you want to think about it that way. Now this is a problem in real world scenarios. For example, let's suppose I have some other code, somebody else's code. Maybe it's a utility that I found on the internet, or some code somebody gave to me, or even something I wrote a long time ago. In real world scenarios, we do that a lot. So let's suppose I had some utility.js file, and in it, let's say a guy named Steve wrote it, and what I don't know is that Steve called his variable person. The functionality that I was looking for, let's say, was some log person function, and I just wanted to use his code, so it goes ahead and logs person. So Steve thought this was a great little thing that he built, and I come along and I use his code and I call it log person. call log person from his code, what do you think you're going to see? It's still Tony. Why? Because by the time I call this function, the variable person has been overwritten by my version of it. See, they're both sitting in the global namespace. So there's a variable called person, and when I declared a variable called person, I overrode the original. And so when this function got called, Tony is what was sitting as a value in memory, not Steve. This can cause some terrible situations and some really hard to find bugs. If Steve, who's creating a reusable piece of code, was smart, he'd make some kind of namespace or container for everything that he was writing so that you didn't have that pollution. There's a few ways to do that, but I'll just do it the simplest way. I'm just going to create an empty object. That's just JSON notation for an empty object, and I'll then start putting things inside that object. So I'm going to create a function called logPerson inside the Steve's app object, and it's going to log the value of person inside Steve's app. So now when I call logPerson, well, first this won't work because now it's not in the global namespace, this function. It is underneath Steve's app. Now I can call Steve's app.logPerson, and I see Steve. See that? My variable didn't override the global namespace variable of this because it's not in the global namespace, it's inside an object. If I did want to update that person value, I could then go Steve's app.person equals my person. This one, sitting in the global namespace. And now I should see Tony. So encapsulation, making sure that we're not polluting the global namespace, is a very important aspect of building extensible, reusable, and complex software. So AngularJS makes this a fundamental part of its structure. When you build an AngularJS app, you're going to see that there are certain elements and structural concepts that have the goal of not polluting the global namespace, making sure that variables and functions that are defined don't collide and contradict variables and functions defined elsewhere. And that allows for a nice big ecosystem of really cool code that we don't have to worry about is going to interfere with other code without realizing it. That's the global namespace. That's this JavaScript aside. I know what you're thinking. We haven't done any AngularJS code yet. Well, that all stops now. Let's get into the structure of an AngularJS application. Modules, apps, and controllers. We'll start here. All right, let's start off by setting up our AngularJS application. I have some HTML here, the same HTML basically that I had with some Bootstrap, but now I'm loading AngularJS. Let's go over there for a moment and let me show you what that looks like. If you go to angularjs.org, this is the website for AngularJS. You can read the documentation here, but it's actually can be pretty confusing. But all I want to show you here is under Develop, Download. You can then go to this list of all the versions of Angular that have ever existed, at least to what they have stored here since 0.1. We're going to go all the way to the bottom to the release candidate for 1.3. I go in there and there's lots of files. We're going to ignore most of these for now. We'll come back a bit later. But here is angular.js. This file is the non-minified version. Let me zoom in just a little bit. It has lots of comments and lots of code. This is AngularJS. This is all this code that's been written and given to you freely so that you can build web applications using all these features. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the minified version, which gets rid of all of the unneeded white space and renames variables to really short names, just to make the download size smaller. And I grab this address and I just plop it in a script tag in my HTML page, and now I have Angular and I'm ready to go. That's all you have to do. Now I still have an app.js file, and I'm going to go over there and we're going to start building my AngularJS app. Now remember that whole concept about not polluting the global namespace? Well, AngularJS is going to make sure we don't do that. In fact, we're only going to put one variable into the global namespace, and that variable is our app, our application. So I'm going to call it my app, and then I'm going to use all of this code that was available to me inside the AngularJS source code. So if you look around, there's this global Angular object, if you find it around in the code eventually. And inside that global Angular object, there's all kinds of code. And one of those things is a module. So that's hidden down deep, down inside the core of Angular code as well. And that module is a function that takes a name, which is the name of your app. I'm just going to name it the same as my variable. It's a nice convention. And it takes an array of dependencies. Now we're not going to have any dependencies right now, and we'll explain what those are pretty soon. But for now, we have one object in the global namespace, and only one that is an Angular module, that is to say an app. Now remember how we said that the model, that is the data and the objects, want to be connected to the view automatically? That's that MV star, that MV whatever concept. Well, this is where we start doing that. We're going to tell Angular where in the view this app lives. That is to say, what part of the view is going to be controlled by the app. Now, I usually like to just put it at the very top. ng-app equals my app. What is this doing? Well, remember, we're allowing ourselves a custom attribute. This is one that all that code over here, this AngularJS code, it looks for this particular attribute. And it says, okay, everything inside of this, everything from where this tag starts to the bottom, or everything inside that area of the DOM tree, the document object model, stores all this stuff as basically kind of like a tree where this is the top and this is a child and this is a grandchild. So everything inside of it is now connected to this variable in the global namespace. And from here, that means that this app now has this view. Get that? So ng-app, this custom attribute, is what AngularJS looks for, and it looks at the value of that and matches that to a variable name. It looks in the code and says, yeah, I have a variable in memory called my app, so I can connect it to this part of the DOM, to this part of the HTML. At this point then, everything else we add, we're going to add to the my app variable. Everything else will be underneath that object, so it doesn't pollute the global namespace. And it will take advantage of all of the special things that an Angular module can do. The first thing we're going to do, the thing you really always are going to do, is declare a controller. So we do dot controller. That's available to you because my app is an Angular module. And this controller object or function that was defined inside all that AngularJS code for any Angular modules takes a name. I'm just going to call it main controller. And it takes a function. I'm going to finish the function, finish the controller, and that's it. I've just created a new controller. It has a name and a function. In other words, a place to put the code associated with this controller. Now, again, we're looking to connect the view to the model. This is the controller for the view. Now, while this whole thing is the app, I can actually define then a view inside my HTML. It can actually be a sub part of my HTML. I can make a div and do ng-controller and then give it that name. AngularJS does something very similar to what it did with the app. It sees that custom attribute in the DOM, in the HTML, and it says, I'm going to look for a controller on this app with that name. And it'll find it because I named it the same. And then now any code inside of here will be associated with controlling the HTML inside of here. Get that? The controller in here will be the model, and this is the view. And AngularJS is going to keep those things bound for me without me having to do any special work myself. All that code in that angular.js file does that already. So now you have the bare bones of an AngularJS application. A module, just one variable sitting in the global namespace, and a controller with that same app defined in the HTML using these custom attributes, and the controller defined using these same custom attributes. And now you have essentially your very first AngularJS application. Before we can move any further, we have to have another JavaScript aside. This is a really important fundamental concept, and it's one of those things that you're going to hear when people talk about AngularJS. You may already know what it means, but we'll explain it here. It's called dependency injection. And it's one of those things that you need to understand before we can move on to any other parts of AngularJS, because we're going to use it in just a minute. Okay, so it's one of those phrases, so guess what I'm going to hit you with? That's right, big word alert. Unnecessarily large statement or phrase for something that's actually not that complicated. Emergency break glass. Dependency injection. Giving a function an object. Rather than creating an object inside a function, you pass it to the function. Let's see an example. So here's my little Hello World app again. I'm going to go ahead and start up the browser and get open the console. And then I'm going to go to my empty app.js file, and I'm actually going to define an object first. I'm going to define an object using a function. Remember, everything in JavaScript is a function, even objects are functions. And inside my person object, when you create a new person object, it's going to have a first name and a last name. This is just a way of creating objects in JavaScript. And then I'm going to create a log person function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new person. Let's call him John. And I'm then going to log to the console John. And then I'm going to call this function. See that? An object, I create a new object of that type, give it that first name, last name, log it to the console, and I call that function to do that. And when I refresh, there it is. First name, John, last name, Doe. This function is dependent on this variable John. It's a dependency. If something were to change about John, you would have to change it inside this function. That's bad. We prefer not to do that. It makes for really complicated or difficult to deal with code. So instead we're going to use dependency injection. Sounds complicated, right? I'm going to accept a person object as passed to my function, and I'm going to create the person outside the function and pass it to the function. Refresh, same thing. That's dependency injection. I know what you're thinking. What? That's so simple. All it is just pass the object to the function instead of create the object inside the function? Yep, that's all it is. But it's actually pretty important. This log person function now is not dependent on how John is created. I could create John like this with a new person, or I could go get him from the database, or I could do whatever I want. The log person function doesn't care. Just give me the person. The log person is no longer dependent on this person variable. Whatever creates it outside the function is going to then pass it to it. So we're injecting the dependency, kind of like a syringe, right? We're sticking it into this function. AngularJS uses dependency injection when it comes to its controllers and some other instances. Now, it's a very simple concept, but it again enforces a strong, stable architecture for your web applications. And what's more, the way AngularJS does dependency injection is really, really cool. We're going to get into that now. So now we're going to take our first look at one of the most important concepts, one of the most important functionalities within AngularJS. It's a big part of the thing that binds the model to the view. It's called scope, and it's an object from something called the scope service. And it involves dependency injection. Let's take a look how. So here we are back at our basic AngularJS app setup. I still have my app, and I've created a controller, and that controller is tied to a piece of the HTML. So now I'm going to do something kind of interesting. First, let's start up the site, and I'll hit F12 to get the console up. I'm going to pass my controller function an object. It starts with the $, scope. Now the $, doesn't really mean anything special. It's just part of the name, right? Just like any of the other letters. And then I'm just going to log this to the console. Now what would you expect to see? Well, notice I don't have the scope variable declared anywhere in my code. I haven't called this function in any way. So you'd think it would be empty. But when I refresh, you see that it's not. It in fact is a big complex object full of stuff. So what is this? This is AngularJS doing dependency injection. AngularJS, all that code in that angular.js file, defines something called scope. Scope is an object. Its name has the $sign in front. Actually, all AngularJS services, that's what this is, a service, start with a $sign just so that when you're looking at your own code, you can recognize an AngularJS service really quickly. So that's the name of this object. And what AngularJS did was it injected it into this function. It saw that we wanted it, and it passed it to the function. And it can then contain other values. I can add on to the scope object, for example, Tony, or let's say Jane Doe. Refresh. and look into the object, and look, that wasn't there before. I've added a variable onto the scope. Or I could do occupation, coder, refresh, and look, they're both there now. I could even add a function. And that function is there. And I can call it. So no errors there. So the idea is that I can add variables and functions to the scope. Now the scope then becomes that middle piece, that piece between the view and the controller. You have this data. The controller says, okay, I've tied what's in here, what's in this function, to what's in here in the HTML. And this scope then defines the data that will go back and forth between what's in this function and what appears here. We're going to see more examples of this, but to get started, we need to understand exactly what AngularJS did in order to give us the scope. So let's start there. It's time for another JavaScript aside. We just saw something really amazing. We just put the variable name $scope in our function as a parameter to be passed to it, and it suddenly appeared. That's what sometimes makes it feel like we don't understand and can't learn AngularJS, because it does things that one might say, well, that's just amazing, and we just move on. But we really want to understand it. That lowers the barrier to being able to use AngularJS and also makes it less intimidating. So this fundamental concept of passing things to controllers, and we're going to see more of this, how does it work? Well, to understand that, we need to understand a quick thing about functions and strings in JavaScript. So I'm back to my app and controller, and I'm just going to get rid of everything I had added to the controller, and we're going to show something really interesting. So let's suppose, just completely outside of the controller, I'm going to create a new function. Let's say I call it search people. And that function is going to have a bunch of parameters. I might want to search by first name, by last name, by height, by age, and who knows what else, by occupation, etc. Now we're not actually going to write this function, but we have this function sitting there. Now, instead of just declaring it, I'm actually going to set it as a variable. That might make this a little bit clearer. So I have a search people function, and then I'm going to log it to the console. And let's suppose right now that inside it I just return Jane Doe. If I invoke the function, that is actually run the function by calling it with parentheses and just some empty meaningless data right now, and refresh, it gives me back the result of the function. But let's suppose I output or console.log just search people. Whoa, wait a minute. What just happened? It actually returned to me a string, the entire function itself typed out. Right, so I could do this like this. Search people string, if I just set it to search people, it'll be the function, but if I go to string and output search people string, same thing. So you can take a function in JavaScript and convert it to a string. Think about that for a second. That means that if I can take any function in JavaScript and get its string representation, that is the function actually typed out, the way the coder typed it out, then this is just a string. I could parse or do some fancy coding to break apart this string and figure out what the names of the expected parameters are to the function. So I can then make a decision based on what I see. And that's exactly what Angular does. So how does Angular do dependency injection? So I'm going to show you something that you probably will never ever need to actually use, but it's good to know what's happening. So Angular is this object, right, that's created, all part of that angular.js file. And it has an injector with a method called annotate. And I'm going to pass it my function search people. Actually, let's console.log this so you can see it. So this feature inside of Angular, I can pass it a function. And let's see what I get. Wow, look at that. It parsed the string and created an array, one for each parameter, the name of the parameters that the function expects. So if you think about it, if a function contains a certain name that Angular says, hey, I know that name. I know that if I see that, I should create an object and pass that object in that spot to that method. That means I could actually put it wherever I wanted in the function. And AngularJS's code would simply say, hey, there it is, and I'll pass it right there. I'll inject it, dependency injection. I'll pass this object that I create to that spot in the function. And that's what happens here up in the controller. So if I console.log the scope, you can see that this scope object was created and passed to the controller function because Angular looked at the controller function, parsed out what its parameters were, and realized, hey, one of those is scope. So I'm going to create scope and inject it, pass it to the function. This is extremely powerful. This means that all you have to do is put the name of the variable correctly, the name of the object correctly in your function, and you'll get it. Scope is a service that's a part of the core Angular modules, but there are others as well, and they also can get passed to your function simply by putting them in the list. So this is an incredibly powerful feature and really saves us a lot of time and also makes our code more testable, more verifiable, more stable. And that's what AngularJS's structure is doing for you.